Okay, good evening everybody, both online and here in the building. Welcome to our third study in the book of Judges. Just a reminder that the theme for all of the lessons, the overarching theme throughout this year is starting afresh. And it's probably a theme in many workplaces and lots of different ideas as well. And part of the reason for studying Judges is to learn how not to start afresh, how we see quite damaging and negative cycles of behaviour across about 350 years or so. So we'll really get into some of that this week. The first couple of lessons we've looked at have sort of been introductory in a way, and looking firstly sort of in Exodus and Genesis, Exodus and Joshua, and setting up that context there where God had given the land to the people, but he had required his chosen people, the people of Israel, after their exodus from Egypt and their time in the wilderness, so that new generation led by Joshua and Caleb, he had required of them that they move on the people in that land so that they would occupy and own and work that land. And I really don't think the reason is there just because, God was greatly opposed to the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Perizzites and all these people. We see quite clearly from Exodus and from Joshua, and we'll see moving through, that God describes himself as a jealous God. And that's really one of the central themes or the central ways of understanding Judges, is that God is a jealous God, that he chose the people deliberately for this unique relationship. And it was a two-way relationship that he expected from the people, just like you do in a marriage relationship, in a male and female committed relationship, that you expect fidelity, you expect faithfulness. And God frequently likens his relationship firstly to Israel and then later on to the church. He likens it to a marriage relationship. Hosea famously, he instructs Hosea to take a wife to sort of to show the unfaithfulness. Hosea's wife was unfaithful to him, and this was a very direct metaphor of the unfaithfulness that Israel had shown to God. And we see this playing out in Judges. And so, as I said, Judges chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2, sort of down to verse 9, we see Israel moving in, taking the land, following on from the book of Joshua, and we see them sort of doing it incompletely, that through a mix of a lack of faith, a lack of courage, an allowance of being too scared of the enemy, even though God had demonstrated again and again that enemies, no matter their technology, no matter their superiority, that provided they trusted in God, they were able to overcome any enemies, any obstacles to what God had wished for, God had commanded of them and promised to deliver them. And so we see, again, in the latter part of chapter 1 there, the failure of the different tribes within Israel to properly do this, to properly overcome. And that this is going to be a problem, that, as I said, not just the kicking out of Israel, but because God knew that if they were to stay, that there would be a turning of the people of Israel to the gods, to the pagan gods that these local groups worshipped. And as we look tonight in the latter parts of chapter 2 and chapter 3, this is indeed what comes about. The people are turned, the people intermarry, there is that specialness that is polluted, and that jealousy of God is provoked. So we finished last week in chapter 2, verse 9, with Joshua being buried, and we see this warning from God. So an angel of the Lord came and spoke to the people in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. And verse 3, it says, effectively God speaking, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. That's God speaking about the other nations. And then if you, the sort of chronology is a little bit bouncing around, but if you look in chapter 2 and verses 20 to 23, God repeats this same warning. He says to them, the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. So this really is the central crux of Judges, and it's really, again, extrapolating out, making this relevant to each and every one of us. This is the question that is asked of every generation, whether it's literal, physical, nations that worship Baals and Ashtaroths and things, or whether it's a whole range of other temptations that would take us away from God. The central question that all of us must ask is whether we will keep the ways of the Lord and walk in them. And as we'll see throughout Judges, is that there's this perpetual answering of that question, oftentimes in the negative, their inability to walk in this way, and then the need for God to remind them, to deliver them, to restore them, to start afresh. God doesn't want to have to start afresh. He wants to maintain that faithful relationship. We see there in verse 20 of chapter 2, it angers God that people fall away. It saddens and disappoints and frustrates him. He doesn't want to have to constantly, bring people back, but he knows that nevertheless this has to happen. And so we see this happening across generations. And this is one of the key themes for tonight, from tonight's lesson. So chapter 2 and verse 9, they're burying Joshua at the border of his inheritance in the mountains of Ephraim on the north side of Mount Gash. And so Joshua is emblematic of a whole generation that were by and large faithful. It was the generation after that of Moses and those that were kind of left outside the gates, weren't able to inherit the promised land because of their unfaithfulness, because of their doubting of God. This generation that was allowed to come in, largely, again, considered faithful, did a lot of good work in taking the land, but were unable to complete it. God doesn't allow, because of their lack of faith, they don't completely overtake. And so God says, okay, well, these people are going to stay. They're going to be thorns. They're going to be snares. Let's see what you can do. And so verse 10 is really, it's a really sad verse. I know there's lots of sad verses in the Bible, but it says, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. So there's this generational shift, and it's a generational shift that, and it's not, I would argue, out of ignorance that they don't know God. I think it's that there's a deliberate turning away here. And as I said, this is a theme that's repeated. So Judges chapter 2 and verses 16 and 17, and we see, and again, chapter 2 is kind of a summary of what's going to come. And in chapter 3, we start to get into more of the specifics. At chapter 2, 16 and 17, it says, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Verse 17, yet They would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly away from the way in which their fathers walked, in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. Verse 19, and it came to pass, when the judge was dead, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers, by following other gods, to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. Verse 22, God says again, through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord, to walk in them as their fathers kept them, ... or not. So again, there's the possibilities there, and God, from Adam and Eve onwards, makes clear what the requirements are, what obedience is, but also gives us ultimate choice. We are made in God's image. We aren't beasts that just follow our gut and base instincts. We can make moral choices, and part of that deal is that we can choose to do the wrong thing, and there's limits to how much God can protect us from ourselves. And ultimately, we are responsible for the choices we make. Israel was responsible for the choices they made, and as we see again and again, chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, they were left, speaking about the nations that God had left, that he might test Israel by them, to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So you can see verse after verse after verse sets up, or rather, describes the central calamity here, that they have a history. They have a history of following. They have God's commands, and yet they are unable, the next generation is unable to take on that same faithfulness, that they revert to other things. And it's important here to recognize that I don't think this is out of ignorance. I don't think it's out of an absence of the law, an absence of a knowledge of the history. Look at chapter 2 and verse 15. So again, from verses 11 to 14, we're told, verse 10, we said that they didn't know the Lord nor the work which he had done. And then we see the natural consequence of verse 11. Then it starts with, so following on, they didn't know the Lord. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. They bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, so he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. So this is a general summation of what happens through the time of Judges. In verse 15, he says, wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. So here we see, and as we've seen, we saw back in Exodus that God warned them. He said, I'm a jealous God. I'll get angry if you don't follow me. I will bless you if you do follow me. And he warned them about interrelating with the other nations around about, chiefly because of this turn towards pagan worship, towards idol worship. And so this is what he's warned them about. Remember, Joshua does the same thing. He says, choose for you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. He gives them that warning about, following after these gods, falling into these false worship. And remember, they said back in lesson 1, no, we won't do that. We're committed. We'll do what we need to do. And yet here we see the very next generation not remembering God, doing evil, falling into pagan worship. So again, come out with the scope. And then Bob tells me I must get exhausted hands by the end. I'm always flashing my hands about. And now I have a screen audience as well, so I probably look like a fool, but when you sort of get going, you don't really think about such things. The point here is that God doesn't expect some sort of ignorant followership. He makes clear what is required. He made clear to Adam and Eve what was required. He made clear, he carved it in stone and gave it to them. He kept aside a whole tribe, that of the Levites, in order to serve as the priestly caste, to serve as into that role. It would be inconceivable that they did not know who God was, what he had done. It would be inconceivable that they didn't know, the delivery from the hand of Egypt. This isn't all that far away. There would be oral history. There would be teaching from father to son, from parents to children. It's pretty clear that they knew what to do and that God had warned them about what might happen. And yet here we see them falling into that. So we too can't claim ignorance. We are told, aren't we? We have the word of God. We are told what makes God angry. We are told how to avoid what makes God angry. There's nothing really that's unique about the people in Judges. And we can look at them and slap your forehead and wonder why on earth they do that. But again, we can come forward into the period of the kings and we see the same problems that are there. Skip forward to the time of Christ and we see Christ condemning the perverse and the wicked generation, even though they had that whole history. They have the law, they have a record of all of these things. That was their focus. They narrowed down into the minutiae of how much you should tithe and all of these sorts of things, and which widows they could take advantage of by using some loophole in the law to get paid. All of these sorts of things. So it wasn't that they didn't know the law. It was refusing to keep it. Remember what Jesus said. Many on that day will say, Lord, Lord, I thought I was right. I thought we knew what to do. Remember the rich man and his brothers versus Lazarus. The rich man saying, go back, tell my brothers, if someone comes back from the dead, that'll definitely shake him up. They'll definitely turn to you. And he's told, they have Moses and the prophets. They have enough evidence. Again, John chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31. These things were written. Plenty of other stuff happened. This was written so that you may know, and in knowing have life eternal, etc., etc. And so these record that we have isn't dry history. This is just a previous generation that can behave in exactly the same way that we can. We can be that next generation who didn't know God and who therefore did evil in the sight of God and who therefore angered God, who therefore allowed problems to happen, who therefore caused great distress in the nation of Israel, who therefore needed redemption. Sound familiar? Sound like the cycle of history running its way through? So, again, I think this is really important way of getting into Judges. And we'll look at the minutiae and we'll look at, Samson and Deborah and all these different characters and all that they did. But also just keep in the back of your mind or somewhere in the middle of your mind this sort of broader idea of not knowing God, but knowing God's word and choosing the other path, choosing to indulge, choosing to be tempted away. Just as, that warning about adultery isn't, the act of fornication. Adultery is lusting after the neighbour's wife. Adultery, it starts with that turning the other way. These people, uses the word there, harlot. You see this sort of phrasing frequently, that turning away towards an unfaithfulness. And God warned them about it, and yet they still end up there. Just a bit of a note. Again, it's probably a very busy slide, but it sort of, I think, captures quite well. I'm happy to share these around. But the difference between Israel's God and pagan gods. So it mentions in there the Baal and the Ashtoreths. So again, this isn't necessarily just one god, but it's kind of like a hierarchy of gods. A lot of them are kind of centered around sort of fertility. And again, remember that most of these cultures or groups are agrarian, and so they're really dependent on the cycles and the seasons. So they need, the Nile River to flood. They need the Euphrates and whatever to give them the rainfall. We're somewhat insulated from these things because we have Coles and Woolworths and a stock and people like Michael to really figure out agricultural production that's not so dependent upon, the next 6 months or, animal crops that fail. And likewise, families and the blessing of children and the curse of not having children. All of these things are really acute. And so a lot of this pagan worship is really centered around nature, centered around, again, sexuality and sort of prostitution and these sorts of things in their temples. Again, sort of made things. So it says there that it's in nature, that they're impersonal. So they kind of always need to be assuaged. And you see them, remember around Elijah's time, that the prophets of Baal are cutting themselves and sort of hurting themselves and trying to have Baal answer them in some way. We see, for instance, Molech, where children are put in a furnace and burnt as an offering to the god, again, so that the next crop will work or whatever it might be. And so the very product of fertility they're destroying in order to be part of these sort of cult-like behaviors. This is what people turn to. This is what Israel was turning towards, turning away from a God who had delivered them the land that they were hoping to produce. Again, it's easy to be astonished, and yet we can't at all be astonished because we see all around about us, and maybe in my own life, a turning away from the one true God all too often. The worshippers really focusing on these sorts of things, so really, perverse behaviors, and so divorced, so far away from God, what God wants and what God asks of his followers. And so we see God is over nature. God is in control of nature. We see Jesus, calming the storms, all these sorts of things. We see God in a very personal way, describes himself as a father, describes himself as someone who cares and who loves, and who, Jesus again describes himself wanting to gather Jerusalem to himself as chicks to a hen. You don't get that from Zeus. You don't get that from the Roman gods. You don't get that from Zoroastrianism, all these sorts of things. And again, we see God calling his people out of darkness, calling them towards good things, towards positive things. And, it's not necessarily straightforward, but it's right and it's beneficial and it's true. And I suspect, again, with this idea of fertility and, sexuality and all these things being mixed up in it, that just as our culture is sort of drenched in kind of perverted and dangerous ideas about these sorts of things, but nevertheless, people find very attractive, very alluring. You read through Proverbs, and again, the proverbial writer to his imagined son is warning about the dangers of sexual immorality, these sorts of things. So I suspect that was a very strong element of the temptation away. And again, how very different is our culture? We may not have giant golden calves in the middle of Ruthven Street, but do we have, temples of hedonism? Do we have expressions of, perversity and these sorts of things? Do we have the equivalent of, I guess, fertility or productive land, which is wealth and the trappings of wealth and these sorts of things? Is that worshipped in our culture? I suspect it probably is to a worrying degree. And so we see everything that Joshua had warned them about, everything that God had warned them about, coming to pass. Chapter 3 and verse 6, it says, they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. So again, a reminder that Judges is a bit of a depressing and frustrating and head-slapping book at times. For verses like this, I spent those first 2 lessons kind of setting up that God had warned them in explicit terms about this. And they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. Small g. This sort of stuff they gave over, despite, again, all of God's demonstration, despite them being successful when they followed God. And so enters the period of Judges where God has to send deliverers, where they are literally taken into captivity, into slavery, or forced under onerous tribute, taxation, these sorts of things. Verse 7, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot their Lord, their God, served the Baals and the Asherahs. And again, as we've seen in the previous chapter, chapter 2, the anger of the Lord was hot. He sold them into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia, and they served under him for 8 years. And then verse 9 is really interesting. Verse 9 says, when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel. They knew who to cry out to. They knew who to ask. They knew who to deliver them. They knew who was right, who was true, who was powerful. Isn't that the most frustrating thing? Their turning to evil, their turning to pagan worship was not a complete forgetting. It was a deliberate choice. And it was a deliberate choice that after this period of, distress and hardship, they were finally ready to turn around from and to call to God. And again, maybe, the text there, maybe they'd been crying out for that 8 years, and then God decided that's long enough, I'll listen to you. But the point being is that they were clearly happy to go into pagan worship until it got really troublesome, and then they decided to cry out to the Lord. And God doesn't want us to be at our lowest ebb to turn around. But sometimes that's what it takes, isn't it? And again, coming forwards, Jesus teaches the same thing. What's the parable of the 2 sons and the father? The prodigal ends up in the same place that the people in Judges here end up in. The pigsty is the same as being taken by Mesopotamia. It's the same sort of ultimate endpoint, and the idea is that one needs to return. And so in the first pass we see here Othniel. We saw Othniel briefly in chapter 1. He was taking a particular portion of land, again successfully, and then he was rewarded with I think a daughter of Caleb, and and these things. But then Othniel made a judge, and so this is the beginning of this sort of redemption here. Is described in verse 9 of chapter 3 as a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them. And then they had a period of rest, it says in verse 11, for 40 years. And then Othniel dies. And verse 12, more head slapping, more frustration. The children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so what happens? The Lord strengthens Moab as the nearby, and Eglon the king, and they take over. And again, I won't read the rest of chapter 3, but basically Eglon is kind of a classic, big fat king, sort of probably, well-fed, these sorts of things. And Ehud all gets pretty bloodthirsty, probably reflective of the nature of the times. But Ehud basically serves as a personal assassin, and it says there that he buried the sword or the dagger up to the hilt in this particular king, and then he was able to get away. And as a result of that, basically, the period of Moab is overcome, and Ehud, just as Othniel before him, delivers the people and is able to lead them. And then the end, verse 31, we're told that Shamgar, who again, in the bloodthirsty times, killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad, he also delivered Israel. So, as I said, some bits you get quite a lot of description. Other judges just get the one verse, and we won't go into all of that. Next week we'll look at chapters 4 and 5 that are all about Deborah and Barak, again one of the more well-known judges, one of the more well-known female characters of the Bible. But tonight really has been on that focus on that generational forgetting of God, that generational descent into pagan worship, that pagan worship really offending the jealous nature of God, and that as a result of that pagan worship, they suffered at the hands of the nations thereabouts, whereas God was testing them. God was testing their faithfulness, and they failed, and they needed to be delivered by the judges, hence the book that we have. But that this isn't unique to the people of this time, that this cycle is writ right throughout history. And so the question that I want to consider tonight, the question to leave us with, and we'll discuss here, is how can the church avoid this? If this can be so prevalent, how can the church make sure that the next generation doesn't go down this path? What obligation does the present generation, however that might be constituted, have to do its best? Bearing in mind we all have our own individual responsibilities and decisions to make, but there's clearly ways in which we can try to mitigate and try to reinforce these things. So I think that's the question that we'll leave with tonight from Judges chapters 2 and 3. Thanks very much to all those online.